meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill, and in order to drive a car legally in most countries, the driver is required to have a license to do so. In theory, a person must demonstrate their knowledge of the various traffic laws and principles of safety before being issued such a license by their respective government. It is true that cars themselves are older than driver's licenses, but traffic laws are much, much older than cars. Various nations and empires throughout history have written laws, collected tolls, and patrolled their roads to keep them safe and profitable. So what were these first traffic laws? And how did they develop into what we see on the highways of today? How did mankind establish the rules of the road? Let's start about 4,000 years ago. In the second millennium BC, roads had already been around for a couple thousand years or so. By this time, many roads were stone paved, and wheeled vehicles being pulled by animals or people were not uncommon. There were, in terms of legislation, two types of roads at that time: those within a village, town, or city limit, and the roads that connect them together. The in-town roads, or streets of the time, had the most traffic as people went about their business within a city. These roads were regulated by the local government of the city, and what little documentation and depictions from that time that remains suggests that the regulations were mostly to keep large vehicles from blocking traffic or to keep people from running horses through town. Roads between cities was a whole different situation. Although most of these roads were not actually paved, nonetheless there existed large road networks that connected major cities of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Traveling on these roads could be rather dangerous. These long roads, or highways, were not always patrolled by the nation that they crossed, and thus bands of thieves would often lurk in ambush at certain vantage points along the route. These bandits, or highwaymen as they were called, would often demand a tribute payment to be allowed to pass, or sometimes just steal whatever they wanted from the traveler. It was from this situation that the first true rules of the road were established. Though not written into laws at the time, two principles of interstate travel became common practice throughout the world. The first is this: don't travel alone. The more people you have in your traveling party, the more likely the bandits will just not bother you and let you pass, as you may likely be in greater number and just as well armed. Large trade caravans became the standard when going between cities, and it was quite common for travelers not associated with the caravan itself to just follow it as if they were. The caravan masters of the time encouraged this, as it added yet another sword to their fighting strength. The other rule was this: keep to the left. This again goes to the whole highwayman issue. Most people are right-handed, and since strangers on a road are not people that are considered trustworthy, having them pass going the other way to one's right meant that the traveler could have his weapon ready quicker if they passed on the left side. Though vehicle caravans typically used the center of a road, people and animals tended to travel on the left side for this reason. By the first millennium BC, another unwritten rule began to establish: be ready to pay a toll. The earliest written records of tolls go back some 2,700 years, but it's probable they existed for far longer. Now, there is an implication to toll roads which limited their use. Whomever receives the toll payment is, to some extent, responsible to keep you safe on the road in return. Thus, the first tolls were paid to travel across bridges or special roads that were regularly patrolled. In the case of bridges, the money was used to maintain the bridge and keep it usable, as well as increase the coffers of the builder. For roads, tolls would pay the maintenance of the road as well as its military protection. Often, the towns connected by a road would all pitch in with soldiers and share in the tolls collected. Indeed, in Iron Age Germany, a number of mountain passes were toll roads managed by the local tribes and city-states. Note that at this time, the large trade caravans typically paid little or no toll at all. The reason was simple. They didn't need protection, and if you told them to pay a toll, there was a chance they'd just tell you to get stuffed and take their goods elsewhere. But small groups and individuals would pay for this protection, and so keeping a bit of change with you when traveling was wise. I still keep coins in my car for this very reason. So let's move on to the Romans. With over 50,000 miles of roads built, you can bet that they had some very specific laws regarding the use of their roads. The Romans built highways that were designed to support heavy loads, wagons, chariots, marching armies, and such. However, the idea of city planning was not initially applied to places like Rome, and so many laws regarding the use of vehicles within city limits were strictly enforced. During the Punic Wars, there was a law in the books that forbade women to ride in a vehicle, though this law was repealed later. However, during the reign of Julius Caesar and afterwards, that law was reinstituted, as well as a litany of others. By the imperial era, Rome's cities were riddled with narrow, meandering streets and alleys that were crowded with pedestrian traffic. A series of national laws, known as the Lex Julia, had been written in the 1st century BC, and one of the sections of this book of law pertained to the use of roads, the Lex Julia Municipalis. This series of laws was a sweeping legislation across all cities in Italy and elsewhere to relieve the traffic situation in towns. Laws included in this book were: wheeled vehicles were prohibited within city limits during the first 10 hours of daylight each day. Thus, if you needed to drive through town, you'd have to wait until it was very late afternoon or even near dusk before being able to proceed. Thus, most wagons delivering goods did so at night, and passenger wagons or chariots did so as well, or before dawn. Now, there were exceptions to this. During what we would consider a parade, a triumphal procession, the general would ride in a chariot. Also, certain members of the clergy, such as Vestal virgins, were exempt and could use their wagons in the day. Vehicles of any kind were prohibited in residential areas. This was easy to regulate, as the Romans erected standing stones across the street entrance that one could easily walk past, but vehicles could not pass, much like the poles found on bike paths and such today. Also, the roads were built with a specific series of wide stones at the intersections, what we would know as a crosswalk in those areas of a Roman city. Horses and mules were also not allowed during the daytime. If you were wealthy and wanted to ride, your option was a hand-carried litter during the day. Also, business owners were prohibited from placing any obstructions in the streets during daytime, including products, advertisements, displays, and such. At night, when most restrictions were lifted and vehicles and horses could pass freely through the streets, other problems arose. The main roads connecting cities were wide enough for two-way travel, but the city streets and alleys, for the most part, were only wide enough for one wagon or chariot at a time. And since one-way streets had not been instituted, the driver would employ a runner to go ahead of the vehicle and ensure that no other vehicles would enter the street and block the way. This was quite important, as reverse was not an easy option for these horse or mule-drawn vehicles, and if two met in a narrow alley, it could take hours and a lot of blood pressure to get things sorted out. If there was a violation of the law in the city streets, there were those present to enforce them, the first traffic cops. Under Roman law, both during the Republic and imperial times, magistrates called aediles were responsible for city street maintenance and order. Large cities would have 4 such persons, who in turn employed freed slaves known as vigils to patrol the streets. These foot cops had a number of duties. Keeping the streets clear of debris or obstacles was one of them. Violators were most commonly shopkeepers in this case. Also, if someone tried to use a vehicle or horse during restricted hours, they'd be the ones to haul them in. And they kept a watchful eye out for fires and were the first responders in case one broke out. Now, if you got caught in some sort of street law wrongdoing, which was almost always during the day since the laws were not in effect at night, your fate had much to do with what offense you were accused of and your social status. The most common offenses were of the shopkeeper putting out his wares in the street kind, and the goods would be collected by the vigils and brought to the appropriate aediles. The shopkeeper would pay a fine based on how much stuff was obstructing the street and then be able to collect his goods and be done. In a similar manner, a common citizen that violated the horse or vehicle laws would also be taken to the lower court and pay a fine. However, if you are a person of high political or social status, you'd instead face the prefect of the city. who would hear your case and either levy a serious fine or dismiss the matter. In any case, traffic violations as a whole were rather rare in ancient Rome and didn't create much revenue for the government. Once outside the city limits and on Roman highways, only one actual traffic law applied. A Roman legion has the right of way. When a legion was on the march, it was much more than just soldiers. Many horses, wagons, and chariots were also in the formation, and they took up most of the road. So if a legion was coming, stand aside. Beyond this, the roads were regulated by the unwritten rules of the road. Travel on the left side, have some change for tolls, and don't travel alone. Though it is notable that throughout most of the history of the Roman Empire, the roads were fairly safe to travel. Roman troops were on the march constantly, going to new areas to conquer, quelling uprisings, and, most often, simply rotating the duty stations of soldiers. And with roads having as many legionnaires on them as civilian travelers, the work of a highwayman became much more risky. Of course, once the Roman Empire collapsed, the highwaymen took over and roads became dangerous places again. The old rules of the road still applied, especially the don't travel alone one. For several centuries, trade between cities and countries was done through large caravans or by sea. However, the Crusades happened, a bunch of them. And many people in Europe that did not actually go and fight were still interested in visiting the Holy Land. Keeping pilgrims safe on their journey wasn't easy, hence the establishment of organizations like the Knights Templar. And in 1300, Pope Boniface VIII issued an edict to all pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land: stay on the left side of the road. This was the first time some kind of legislation regarding what side of the road to use was issued on a large international scale. It wasn't until the 18th century that various nations in Europe and elsewhere began to take road legislation more seriously. This century witnessed considerable amount of social change, and it was reflected on the highways and streets. In the previous centuries following the fall of Rome, road safety and maintenance was not regularly addressed on the highways of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Though nations and empires did rise and fall in those lands during that time, and some of those empires, such as the Byzantines, did make some efforts to maintain their roads, it was not universally practiced. Thus, the rules of the road that had been followed since the Bronze Age were basically just accepted practice. The 1700s would see this end. It was in this century that advances in city planning, public works, and sanitation caused a major population explosion. Cities became more crowded, and many people moved into new villages or suburbs that were growing around the major cities of the world. Larger populations needed more commerce and supplies, so traffic increased on the streets, roads, and highways. Additionally, the new small towns that grew along the roads and highways were able to police their roads more effectively, and the problem of highwaymen robbing travelers went largely extinct in Europe. Two other events happened in this century that also had a significant impact on road laws: the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment. First, the Industrial Revolution. The engines that began the century were Newcomen engines and specifically used for pumping water from mines. But by the 1790s, engines were used for all sorts of industrial applications, from milling to fabricating to smelting to forging and beyond. Anywhere that you had a source of water, you could plant a steam engine and do something with it. This caused an explosion of raw and finished goods to flood the world market. Add to this an influx of wealth and material goods from various colonial efforts, as well as a larger European population to consume these goods. The result was that roads were suddenly subject to a level of traffic not seen since the days of the Roman Empire. Now, the Enlightenment had a dramatic effect on road legislation, or at least in how laws would be written when it came to streets and highways in the nations of the world. It was during this time that philosophers like René Descartes, John Locke, and Immanuel Kant began to teach the concept of what would be coined as separation of church and state. This was important regarding the highways of the world that had international travel. For hundreds of years, international highways were managed by the Catholic Church. Although the Church rarely possessed the means to ensure safe roads for travelers, it was the Pope's edicts regarding roads that were most commonly regarded as the laws of the highways. The Enlightenment philosophers and politicians argued that managing international roads was not an ecclesiastic responsibility, but rather a civil one, and therefore the nations were responsible for road maintenance and safety, not the church. Of course, the Enlightenment did affect many things beyond just roads. For example, the European aristocracy of the time. In countries where political civil unrest sprang up, the rulers and the wealthy would often need to get in their carriages and get out of town as fast as they could. This was actually quite common in France, Russia, and elsewhere. Of course, these lords and ladies would use the left side of the road, in their carriage being pulled by many horses at breakneck speed, slowing down for nothing. And if you were a peasant at the time and smelled the winds of revolution, you'd just play it safe and keep to the right, making a clear path for the panicked nobles trying to save their lives. And so the nations of the world sat down to decide what side of the road to travel on. Well, no. With no international governing body to officiate, nations began to decide the matter individually. It was Imperial Russia that first enacted a law in this regard. In 1752, Empress Elizabeth made a declaration that effectively said, "Within Russia, everyone shall travel on the right side of the road." A few decades later, the new and short-lived French Republic also wrote a law stating that all travel should be on the right. They had plenty of noblemen fleeing on the left situations to inspire them. England, on the other hand, did not pass specific laws demanding one side or the other, rather recommendations based on tradition. For example, the General Turnpike Act of 1773 simply stated that traveling on the left side of the road was advisable. This was likewise passed on to be included in the traditions of those colonies that they established. Although England did not actually pass a law stating that driving on the left was required within the empire until 1835, it was accepted practice on the British Isles and all of her colonies, which at one point was over a quarter of the world. Most of the colonies that England established drive on the left to this day. Now, in the case of the 18th century United States, there weren't very many roads and there wasn't much of any industry, so it really didn't make a difference at the time. The first American road law was enacted on the Philly to Lancaster Turnpike in 1792, and it was travel on the right side of the road. Now, some folks have said that this was due to a suggestion by Lafayette made during the Revolution, but in my view, it was most likely due to the Enlightenment. Thomas Jefferson was quite the admirer of John Locke, a very outspoken promoter of the concepts of separation of church and state and the right of revolution. Jefferson was aware that the Catholic Church was the one who made the old go on the left law, and that the USA of the time was mostly Protestant. Additionally, this turnpike began in his hometown, and so he had quite the influence on how it was managed. So, Jefferson pushed this law forward to ensure that travelers in the United States of America would be on the right side of the road. After all, he wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. John Locke's right of revolution principles are in the Declaration, and the separation of church and state are codified in the Constitution. Jefferson reasoned that by opposing British road tradition and traveling on the right, it honors the Declaration and the USA's right to revolution. By disobeying Pope Boniface's State of the Left edict, Americans demonstrate their support of the Constitution and separation of church and state laws contained therein. So by the time we get to the early 19th century, the left or right side of the road had been established by their respective countries. The management of streets and highways was, in most nations, absorbed into their public works, and laws began to be enacted to maintain and control the roads. However, the effects of the Industrial Revolution came into full swing in the first half of the century, and keeping the flow of trade goods moving became more problematic. In the first few decades of the 19th century, railroads developed for the purpose of moving either very heavy freight or lots of people across large overland distances. At the same time, the streets and highways of industrialized nations became cramped with wagons full of all kinds of finished goods. Moving small cargoes over various loads became a logistical challenge that the city planners and highway engineers needed to address. This caused a number of new laws to be written in many countries, with two in particular being most common: speed limits and traffic circles. Now, the whole speed limit thing was kick-started by two inventions, the locomotive and the steam carriage. Locomotives, of course, need special tracks or railroads. They wound up getting some legislation of their own, and speed was amongst them. Even in the early days, locomotives were capable of speeds much faster than horse-drawn wagons were capable of, and trains traveling at speeds in the range of 30, 35, or even 40 miles an hour was quite scary at the time. As a result, the first true speed limit laws were written regarding rail travel. However, this concept was rather quickly applied to roads as well. By the 1820s, steam carriages began to ply the highways and streets of England and continental Europe. Unlike railroads, steam carriages had to share the road with people, livestock, horse-drawn wagons, and whatnot. Such carriages were typically not as fast as locomotives, but speeds in the 25-mile-an-hour range were doable by many of them. This was far faster than anything else on the road, and since brakes were not particularly useful, runaway carriages were a real and unfortunately common problem. Many countries enacted maximum speed laws during this century, both in their highways and city streets. In most cases, these laws didn't specify a particular speed, but rather a relative measure. The most common measure was a horse's gallop. Whether on a steam carriage or not, if you were traveling at a horse-running speed, you were speeding. If caught, you could face a fine for recklessness. It was in the latter half of the 19th century that speed limits in either mph or kph became enacted. Most countries made the distinction between highway and city street speeds. The most common highway speed limits were 10, 12, and 15 miles per hour, or 16, 20, and 24 kilometers per hour, while city streets were usually limited to 5 miles per hour, or kph or under. The notable exception was Great Britain. Though initially they did have established a 10-mile-an-hour speed limit in 1861, in 1865 the Red Flag Act was put in force. This was specifically targeted towards mechanical vehicles of any kind on English roads. The maximum highway speed was 4 miles per hour, and the city speed limit was a mere 2 miles per hour. And a motor vehicle had to have both a man ringing a bell and blowing a horn on the thing, and a man walking ahead of it waving a red flag. It would be in late 1896 that a new law was passed rescinding the red flag law and allowing British motorists to travel on highway speeds at 12 miles per hour. England again paved the way with creating traffic circles. The first traffic circle was in Bath, England, being built in 1768. But in the early 19th century, they spread to London and beyond, and by the 1850s, traffic circles could be found in France, Germany, the USA, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. Along with these roundabouts, as they are often called, the concept of the one-way street became popular. Unlike ancient Rome, most cities didn't forbid horses and wagons from using city streets during the day, so the idea of regulating the traffic on narrow streets and alleys to flow in only one direction did alleviate the problems of wagons jamming up such roads. Of course, some sort of signage needs to be in place to enforce one-wayness of a road, which became the first traffic signs. For the direction of the flow, an arrow was used, often with the words "one way" painted on it. For the opposite direction, the first signs were simple red disc. Some countries put a white strip in the center of the disc. So when we get to the turn of the 20th century, road traffic was under some control. Speed limits, one-way streets and traffic circles, toll roads, and everyone traveling on the same side of the street in their respective directions all was relatively well. Then cars showed up on the scene and screwed up everything. Yes, cars did show up in the late 19th century, but they were not, as far as legislation goes, taken particularly seriously. Cars of that period were, for the most part, slow, prone to break down, noisy, smelly, and difficult to operate. Many, if not most folks of the time, thought that they were a passing fad or novelty. Some rich weirdos would buy them, but normal people would just look on and shake their head, kind of like bell-bottoms and disco. However, unlike 1970s music and fashion sense, cars developed in applied technology and reliability. By 1900, it appeared as if they would actually become a real nuisance to the roads, and something would eventually have to be done. Even before 1900, some things had been done, at least at local levels. The first legislation regarding cars specifically happened in Germany. Carl Benz built his Motorwagen in 1885, and by 1888 he had built a handful of them and in the process of refining his design. Some of the folks in his town complained about it, claiming that his machine was noisy, smoky, and scared the horses. So Carl went to the authorities and in 1888 was given a permit to operate his machine on the roads in his town. Other inventors in other countries copied his initiative, and thus what would eventually become the driver's license was born. But for the most part, 19th century laws regarding cars were done at a local level. Specific villages, towns, and cities would issue permits for operations of cars, enact laws regarding the times they could be used, a la ancient Rome, or, in some cases, ban them outright on their streets. Not until cars became far more commonplace in the 20th century did countries start to write laws concerning cars on streets and highways at a national level. In the first decade of the 20th century, the first national laws regarding the operation of cars began to appear in Europe and elsewhere. Amongst the first was the requirement to register a car with the local authorities. The concept was this: when a car was purchased or brought to a town, the vehicle needed to be presented to the local government, be inspected, and then, if all looks acceptable, issued a registration plate that would be affixed to the car. This plate was proof that the car was on the roads legally and that the fees for the registration were paid. These fees were usually primarily for road maintenance in their respective countries. At about the same time, driver's licenses became national requirements in most industrialized nations. Unlike the local permits of the 19th century, these licenses were issued by a national government, allowing the holder to operate a car, any car, within their borders. Most countries required the driver to pass a test, be it written, on the road, or both, to be issued such a license, and thus had proven to the state's satisfaction that they knew how to operate a car safely. Despite licenses and registrations, cars were still dangerous. Traffic laws of the previous 4,000 years or so did not have cars traveling at 30 or 40 miles an hour in mind, and speed, if not managed, does kill. Among the first people to attempt to address this problem worldwide was a man who has been called the father of modern traffic safety, William Phelps Eno. He was born in New York in 1858, and by middle age had seen the slow infiltration of automobiles in the city. By 1900, he began to write articles regarding road safety and the use of cars. Being both a successful businessman and local legislator, he put his ideas on the roads, and although he himself never drove a car, his principles of road safety endure to this day. Many of the things he spoke about, traffic circles or roundabouts, one-way streets, sidewalks, crosswalks, and traffic signs, had existed long before his birth. However, he applied their use specifically to the automobile. Since cars can travel at speeds much faster than a man or a horse, and do so for long distances, the rules of the road must be clear. Signs stating any local road ordinances must be clearly and simply stated. The use of symbols, for example, a red octagon to mean stop, were his concept. He proposed that these simple laws be integrated into the driver's licensing process to ensure that anyone on the road understood them and obeyed them. Eventually, people began to even paint stripes on roads. Now, there's some controversy as to when this actually began. For example, a dentist living in Los Angeles back in 1909 did paint a white stripe down the middle of the road that his house was on in the hopes that people driving cars would stay on their side and help avoid accidents. However, this was done of his own accord and was not part of any law or ordinance. It was 2 years later in Michigan that actual legislation requiring a center line to be painted on a road appeared. In any case, stripes to divide a road, show traffic lanes and crosswalks, as well as shoulders began to appear all over the world and were fairly common by the time of the First World War. After the Great War, cars became like locusts and began to replace horses and trolleys. Road laws became far more complex, and roads themselves were redesigned specifically for automobile traffic. Nations would come together and agree on common highway laws for international travel. Today, traffic laws are both simple and complex, yet they do keep us safer when plying the highways of the world. And it all began thousands of years ago with basic advice on traveling. For no matter what nation or era you traveled in, Getting to your destination safely is the reason why we have the rules of the road. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.